I work in the South Pole. I know that probably sounds thrilling, and it is. But the reality is the job is incredibly demanding, with long hours that drain you. We were sent to the heart of Antarctica, with nothing but 1,000 miles of ice and snow in every direction. Officially, we worked from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., but without much in the way of recreation, we usually ended up working 18-hour days. Fortunately, we had slow satellite Wi-Fi, which is honestly what kept me from losing my mind during the long, drawn-out hours. Yet, none of this was the real issue. The true problem lay in the oppressive atmosphere. Something about the place just didn't feel right. Most of the facility is underground, with heaters covered on the roof and a cement stairwell as the main entrance. The bunker itself was exactly what you'd imagine. A drab concrete box with separate areas for men and women to sleep. A few rooms for couples too. A large bathroom with showers and stalls, 3 labs, and a fully stocked cafeteria, all devoid of windows. We also had a medical bay and 2 rooms with couches, set up for therapy sessions. Past the double-door entrance was the rec room, complete with a pool table and a bar. The walls were covered in knotty pine paneling straight out of the 1970s. Everything was connected by a long, dingy hallway, including 2 small offices where we spent most of our time. Desks, chairs, nothing fancy. On top of the station, you could climb a ladder to an observation deck with windows to peer outside, but it was usually as cold as the outdoors, so we only went up to smoke. The entire place was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights and a few sad lamps in the corners. Overall, it felt like a dreary, greenish, underground cement prison. Outside, well, it was exactly what you'd expect from Antarctica. Snow stretching endlessly in all directions. It's like the fear of open water, but on land. You feel that same unease, except you have to trudge through it. I was a bit puzzled as to why they brought so many people on this particular expedition. There were 12 of us in total, which was odd since 6 would normally be enough. All of us were professionals in our respective fields, though the variety of expertise was surprising. Typically, you'd have one field working toward a specific goal, but here, we had specialists from multiple disciplines. First, there was an older Finnish doctor, skilled in treating injuries in freezing environments. Then, there was a physicist who, like us, was baffled as to why they'd brought him to the South Pole, since his work was mostly theoretical and usually required an entire team of its own. A British husband and wife team of geologists followed. We also had 3 men in their 30s, handling maintenance and driving, experts in sub-zero conditions, and masters of all things repair-related. There was a biologist as well, a young black woman who always wore her hair in a neat bun and kept her lab coat on at all times. She was all business, no time for fun. Then, believe it or not, there were 2 therapists. The first one fit the image you'd expect, a middle-aged woman with blonde bangs, always smiling warmly and clutching a clipboard. The other was quite different, a tall, lanky man with jet-black hair and a gaunt appearance. Honestly, I couldn't understand why he was a therapist. Even saying hello to him felt intimidating. I never saw anyone go to him unless he specifically asked for them, and I did my best to steer clear of him. There was another man whom I initially thought was the cook, until I realized we had to prepare our own meals. He was a quiet, mousy-looking guy who didn't speak to anyone, and when I tried to talk to him, he would just ignore me. Oddly enough, I ended up liking him the most, because he kept entirely to himself. As for me, I was the chaplain. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Why does a crew of professionals need a chaplain? Honestly, I didn't get it either. But when the organization funding the expedition contacted me, I didn't ask questions. The pay was excellent, and that's rare in my line of work. The mission was slated to last 6 months, with each of us assigned to conduct specific experiments. I wasn't privy to everyone else's assignments, but mine was to journal on the religious implications of the expedition and offer counsel to any team members, regardless of their faith or denomination. I didn't mind the counseling part, but journaling? It felt like something out of a Theology 101 freshman class. Still, the money was good, so I bit my tongue and spent my downtime downloading movies and games to pass the long hours between counseling sessions. Surprisingly, a lot of people came to me for religious discussions. I earned the trust of the maintenance guys when I cracked open a beer with them in the old red rec room and chatted about Catholicism, even though I'm a Protestant minister. At first, they were a bit standoffish, but we quickly bonded. And even though I couldn't bless them or hear confessions, I think it eased their stress to have someone they could talk to about faith, as well as just shoot the breeze. Eventually, I got along well with everyone. The physicist, who was a firm atheist, and I often played pranks on each other. I'd hide his laptop somewhere out of reach, blasting "Jesus Take the Wheel," while he woke me up half the time with "No Church in the Wild." Despite the chills that song gave me, reminding me how far we were from civilization, I considered him my second best friend on the base. My best friend was the quiet, peculiar man. He always seemed to be in the rec room when I was there, but never spoke a word. Indoors, he wore an orange hoodie and jeans, and he usually sat at the dimly lit, makeshift bar, sipping on drinks by himself. I didn't think much of it. Our schedules were all over the place, and honestly, I could sympathize with anyone who wanted to drink away the isolation in a place like this. Most days were lonely. We all worked in our respective areas, often eating lunch alone at our stations, usually frozen meals or MREs. I did spend a fair amount of time chatting with the doctor, a Buddhist. Many mornings we'd meditate in his medical station under the hum of the fluorescent lights. He told me that the place felt strange to him too. It was hard to stay centered in a concrete block buried beneath the snow. Over time, the isolation got to me. When everything was quiet, I'd swear I could hear whispers. After one particular instance where I distinctly heard the words, I started wearing headphones. They were a lifesaver, drowning out the eerie silence and filling my ears with comforting noise. Once a week, a plane would drop off supplies from the coastal base hundreds of miles away. We'd restock on cigarettes, whiskey, and other essentials like food and water. Whoever was funding this expedition had deep pockets. That much was clear. I never met the main backer. I was contacted through intermediaries. From what I heard, the person funding this was incredibly wealthy, very determined, and highly religious. He was deeply invested in the success of this mission, though none of us knew exactly what his ultimate goal was. Also, once a week, we took the snow rover out. It was a massive SUV capable of navigating the snow and ice. We'd go out to take ice samples and check on a previous dig site left by the last crew. I couldn't imagine the people who had to come all the way out here just to build the facility, but I bet they were paid a fortune. Sometimes the whole team would go, just to escape the base and see the sun, though not during a blizzard. But most trips were made by the core excavation crew. We had to wear harnesses attached to the SUV to prevent us from slipping on the ice and getting injured. With the harsh conditions and distance to the site, we could only make these trips once a week. I mention these routines to emphasize how isolated we were. Once that plane left on Monday, it would be another 7 days before it returned. Then, 2 months into our time at the base, came the first big shift. The geologists, the biologist, and one of the maintenance men went out to the dig site that day. They left in good spirits, working for hours before returning, visibly shaken. I was in the rec room with the therapist when they burst through the door, fear written across their faces. The woman geologist immediately ran to the couple's room without a word, her husband chasing after her, calling her name. The biologist was crying. The other therapist, looking like a ghost, silently guided her into his office and closed the door. The doctor stormed in, his voice booming. "What on earth is going on?" "I have no idea," replied the first therapist, anxiety clear in her voice. "Where's Jack?" "And where's the SUV?" I asked, opening the door to look outside. There was nothing, just our flag, a trail of footprints, and miles of ice glittering under the sunlight. Those of us who hadn't gone on the field expedition gathered in the rec room and sat in tense silence for what felt like hours. Meanwhile, behind the door of the tall therapist's office, panicked voices could be heard. Eventually, everyone emerged. The geologist went straight to their room without speaking. The biologist sat down in one of the folding chairs, while the therapist stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of her seat. She had been crying since she returned. "We got there ahead of schedule," she began, trying to steady her voice. "We arrived at the dig site at 0700 earlier than planned, so we started working right away. Everything seemed normal at first. Jack stayed in the SUV, managing the harnesses. I was chiseling at a patch of ice when I heard the others call from below. We watched her, hanging on her every trembling word. She continued, I slid down to the bottom of the hole, probably about 30 meters deep. They had hit something solid. We all worked together, digging and finally pulling out a massive lockbox. At first, we assumed it had been left behind from the previous expedition, but the design was ancient. It resembled something from World War II, heavy, sealed, and unmistakably old. We tugged on the rope to signal Jack, but we didn't get any response. We started calling for him, but he didn't answer. From where we were, we couldn't see him at all. After 10 solid minutes of shouting, we decided to climb back up using our tools. With an extra length of rope, we managed to hoist the box up. It took all three of us, but we did it. When we finally reached the top, Jack was nowhere in sight. We searched the area for over an hour, and given the clear visibility, we should have spotted him. We scoured the ice for footprints or signs of movement, but his tracks only went as far as the SUV. We loaded the box into the vehicle and kept looking. That's when we saw it. Something we should have noticed much earlier. From the top of the SUV, we spotted a massive message carved into the snow. "Run." We all stared at her, dumbfounded. That shared sense of guilt crept over us. The feeling that maybe we could have done more, searched better. Tears welled up in her eyes again. We panicked. We drove off, but none of us really knew how to handle a vehicle on snow and ice. We crashed into a huge pothole about a mile south. We had to abandon the car and walk back. The box is still out there, and Jack is still lost in that frozen wasteland. She broke down in sobs after that and headed back to the dorm. Jack hadn't responded to a single radio call, not even an attempt to reach us. The dig site was an hour's drive from base, and we were thousands of miles from any other researchers. There wasn't much we could do. "First things first," one of the repairmen said. "We need to get our ride back." He geared up, and with another worker, took off on a snowmobile built for short distances. I have no idea how they did it, but somehow they got the SUV back within an hour. By that time, it was getting dark, and continuing the search for Jack would have been too risky. We didn't sleep that night. The odd man didn't even go to bed. He just wandered the halls drinking. I stayed in my room, trying to drown out the sound of quiet sobs coming from down the corridor by listening to music. This place felt like a concrete tomb, buried in the heart of a frozen wasteland. We were utterly, completely alone. Before bed, the doctor had remarked, if Jack's still alive, he might actually be better off out there. The next morning, we all set out. Everyone except the two therapists and the odd man, who I assumed was nursing a hangover. We pulled the locked box from the SUV and left it in the rec room, planning to deal with it later. We searched the dig site and the surrounding area until evening, but found nothing. The message in the snow had vanished, despite no fresh snowfall overnight. There were no tracks, no signs, no body, nothing. We returned feeling defeated, weighed down with guilt over our missing teammate. But when we got back, we were greeted by something strange. A jet. There, on the snow, sat a ski-equipped private jet. And not some rickety plane like the one that dropped us off. This was a high-end, luxurious jet. Inside the facility, we were met with the sound of booming laughter. A short, bald man with a white goatee sat in the rec room with the therapists, smoking a cigar. He was dressed in an expensive suit, and two massive bodyguards stood by the door, both wearing sunglasses. We were taken aback. "Well," the man said, his voice thick with a southern drawl as he turned toward us, "if it ain't the rest of the party." "Who?" I started, but he cut me off. "Allow me to introduce myself." He stood up, extending a ring-covered hand. "Earl, redacted, pleased to finally meet y'all." One by one, we awkwardly introduced ourselves, realizing this was the guy in charge. He invited us into the cafeteria for an official meeting. It was the second odd shift in the trip. He offered his condolences about Jack, assuring us that no one was to blame for his disappearance. "As for that message in the snow," he said, lowering his voice, "this whole place will tell you to run at some point. Don't let it get to you." He finally explained the real purpose of the expedition. Our mission was to uncover any signs of previous human presence at the site. He also revealed that he intended to colonize the South Pole and wanted to study the psychological effects of long-term isolation. That's why he had sent the two mental health professionals and a minister, he added with a pointed look. at me, making me feel exposed and awkward. He thanked us again and wrapped up the meeting with the best steak dinner I'd ever had, prepared by a personal chef he had flown in to express his gratitude. This guy was serious. The next morning, after a breakfast of bacon and eggs, Earl took us, one by one, into the tall therapist's office for a casual chat, or as he so delicately phrased it, to shoot the shit. When my turn came, he treated me with respect, a courtesy I appreciated, especially when people don't know I'm a minister. But it can feel a bit forced when there's pretense. "How are you, Reverend?" he asked softly. "Well," I answered, not quite sure how to respond, given everything that had happened over the past few days. "Glad to hear it," he said with a smile, his eyes briefly dropping to the floor. "Son, I'm going to level with you. You're the most important person here." "How's that?" I asked, unsure whether he was being genuine or just flattering me. He paused, carefully choosing his words. "This trip is more about psychological research than anything else." "What?" I began, but he cut me off. "We needed a religious figure and at least 2 therapists to gauge the mental toll of living in isolation out here. We're thinking about building a new civilization, but we've been testing small groups for short periods first." "Why me?" It was the first of many pressing questions I had. "Well," he said with a grin, "I'm a Methodist myself, but I chose you because of an article you wrote some time back. In the final line, you said something that resonated with me." "What was that?" I asked, unsure which of my writings he was referring to. "To truly understand God, we must also understand his counterpart." In that moment, I knew exactly which article he meant. It was one I wrote after seminary on the study of demonology in modern society, an unsettling topic I didn't revisit often. I shuddered, recalling the research. Clearly, this man had done his homework, but I still couldn't grasp how a short article on demons qualified me for an Antarctic expedition. After our conversation, I rejoined the group, and we mostly just listened to Earl ramble on rather than speaking amongst ourselves. The mood was heavy. While he talked away in the warmth of the room, we couldn't shake the thought that our friend was out there, cold and alone in the vast frozen wilderness. The biologist and geologists kept asking to leave. At first, Earl brushed off their requests, but by the last time, he firmly reminded them they were under contract. After that, they retreated to their rooms, resigned. Earl left later that night, instructing us to report any findings. With his bodyguards, he boarded his jet and was gone as quickly as he'd arrived. Before bed, I swear I heard faint whispering coming from the observation deck, but when I went to check, no one was there. The next day, a massive blizzard rolled in, sealing our fate. We concluded that Jack couldn't have survived 3 days in such brutal, sub-zero conditions. It was a hard truth to accept, but it marked the beginning of a rapid descent into something far worse. That same day, we decided to open the lockbox. It had been welded shut, so the maintenance crew used blowtorches to break the seal. After some effort, they managed to pry off the heavy lid. As it came loose, black soot spilled out, causing us to cough. When the dust cleared, we looked inside. There was nothing. Or rather, nothing significant. All we found were a piece of string, a thimble, and scattered grains of salt. We sat there, baffled, rubbing our heads and exchanging confused glances. Why would something so mundane be buried so deep in the ice? We debated this for a while, until I noticed the physicist quietly slipping away. He looked pale as a ghost, so I hurried after him. "Hey," I called out, catching up with him in the dorm. "You all right?" He stood there, shaking his head, visibly disturbed. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "No." "What's going on?" I asked, wondering what had him so rattled. As I glanced down the hall, I noticed the others heading toward the cafeteria, but the man in the orange hoodie was conspicuously absent. Before I could dwell on that, the physicist's voice snapped me back. "Did you see the writing on the lid?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," I said, confused. "What writing? Can you read Hebrew?" His voice trembled, and I could see him holding back tears. "No," I replied. "I studied Greek." "Wait, can you?" Yeah, he said, his voice cracking. I'm Jewish, or I was. I know enough Hebrew to understand what it said. I wish I didn't. What did it say? I asked, growing uneasy. Dybbuk, he whispered, a single tear rolling down his cheek. I had never seen him like this before, and to be honest, it frightened me. You can't seriously believe. No, he shouted, cutting me off. You know as well as I do that there's something wrong with this place. It messes with your head. The first week I kept hearing footsteps around the shower every morning, only to find out I was completely alone. Listen, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. We're going to be okay. I wish I could have believed my own words. That box carried an unsettling presence, something none of us could quite explain. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps, loud enough to break through the music playing in my headphones. I got up to investigate, but as I moved through the hall, it became clear that no one else was awake. The soft sound of sobbing came from the couple's room, but I knew better than to disturb them. They were going through enough as it was. As I made my way back to my bunk, something caught my attention near the cafeteria. I turned and froze, confronted by the most horrifying sight I had ever seen. The room was in complete chaos. Chairs and tables were overturned, food smeared across the walls and ceiling, with utensils and appliances strewn everywhere. But the center of the floor, that's where the true horror lay. A massive rusted steel cross stood in the middle, and nailed to it was Jack. His body was drenched in blood, his eyes wide open and bursting with ruptured veins. Barbed wire twisted around his arms and legs, with nails driven through his wrists and ankles. He was bald, emaciated, and when our eyes met, he convulsed violently. Then, with a blood-splattering shriek, he screamed one word. Belphegor. I lost it. I stumbled backward, screaming, sliding across the tile floor. Everyone rushed into the hallway, alarmed and confused, asking what was going on. I could barely breathe through the tears and terror, pointing frantically toward the cafeteria, my body shaking uncontrollably. But when they looked inside, everything was normal. No cross, no Jack, no blood. The room was perfectly intact, as if nothing had happened at all. The last thing I remember is standing in the shower, clutching a bottle of Jack Daniels, trying to calm my nerves. 3 hours later, I woke up in the rec room, covered by a blanket. Jane, the therapist, was asleep on the couch across from me. She had been kind throughout all of this, but I knew she must have been disappointed by my complete lack of professionalism. I stood, still feeling the effects of the alcohol. The compound was quiet, the blizzard still howling outside. I wandered through the hall and heard the sobbing again from the couple's room. This time, in my foggy state, I thought maybe they needed help. I knocked gently on the door, but the crying didn't stop. Before I could knock again, a wave of nausea hit, and I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting into the toilet. As I stood up, wiping my mouth, I caught a glimpse of something. A dark, tall figure leaving the bathroom. It vanished before I could get a good look. I had had enough. I went back to my bunk, falling into a restless sleep, but at least I slept. The next morning, I was shaken awake by one of the maintenance men. "Wake up," he said. "The power's out, and people are missing." I groggily sat up and saw him glance toward the hallway. Voices were coming from the cafeteria. "Come on," he said. I noticed that the only other person in the room was the physicist, lying in his bunk with his back to me. "Let's go," I muttered. But he didn't move. He was breathing, so I left him alone and followed the maintenance worker to the cafeteria. The room was dimly lit by emergency candles. Around the tables sat the biologist, Jane, the doctor, and the 2 maintenance men. There were only 6 of us now, less than half of our original group. As I sat down, one of the maintenance men looked at me and said, "Well, look who it is. You gonna scare the hell out of us again?" I didn't respond. I wasn't in the mood for jokes. Instead, I asked where the geologists were. "They're not answering their door," Jane replied, her voice weary. The age and exhaustion showed on her face. "And the other therapist is missing, too." "We're leaving," the biologist chimed in. "As soon as the blizzard dies down. Screw their contracts." "How?" I asked, even though I hated to sound pessimistic. We're 1,000 miles from the nearest base. You're risking certain death for a little cabin fever. We've got a large sled, one of the maintenance men explained. We'll load it up with gas tanks. If we can get within 50 miles of the nearest base, we'll be in radio contact. We have GPS. We'll drive in shifts and take it slow to avoid any accidents. Is this agreeable? The doctor asked, looking around the room. Everyone nodded, the weight of the decision settling over us. In that case, the doctor continued, we'll stick together for the next few days. If the missing return, so be it. If not, well, we'll ask their forgiveness in hell. The day passed in a daze. I couldn't understand why everything felt so off, why we were all so unnerved. We stayed bundled up in the dark, making small talk to pass the time. The candlelight flickered and played tricks on our eyes, and the darkness pressed in around us. We just sat there, waiting. Around 6 p.m., Jane suggested we check on the geologists. We stayed close together as we walked down the hallway, the sound of sobbing still faint but persistent. Jane knocked on their door, then again, louder. When there was no response, one of the maintenance men started pounding his fist against the door, threatening to break it down. He pulled out a key from a ring and slowly unlocked the door. The room was dark as he cautiously pushed it open. Inside was a scene ripped straight from a nightmare. The first thing that hit me was the overwhelming presence of blood. It was everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. Even the lamp was drenched in crimson, bathing the room in a deep, suffocating red glow. On the bed lay the male geologist, his eyes frozen wide in shock, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque expression of terror. His throat was torn open, and one of his legs was gnawed down to the bone. His wife sat beside him, her back to us, her entire body coated in blood. She was sobbing, shoulders shaking, and chewing. She turned to face us, blood dripping from her mouth, still sputtering pieces of flesh as she cried. Her face contorted with a terrifying blend of sorrow and rage. Her mouth opened wide as if to scream, but all that came out was a guttural, choking sound mixed with fragments of meat. The maintenance worker slammed the door shut as we all backed away in a frenzy of panic. "Get the door!" the doctor yelled. We scrambled to the kitchen, grabbing tables and chairs, barricading the door, desperate to trap whatever that thing was inside. Afterward, we huddled in the rec room, everyone in shock. Jane had curled into a fetal position, trembling uncontrollably. Everyone else was crying, barely holding it together. "We leave tomorrow," the doctor muttered, his breath shaky between sobs. The blizzard still howled outside, relentless, and I could swear the wind mocked us with its shrill, taunting cries. At some point, I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by a massive explosion. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet along with the others. We rushed up to the observation deck, squinting through the storm. All around us was blackness, except for one patch of flickering light a few meters away. Through the whiteout, we could make out fire. The SUV was engulfed in flames, gas tanks stacked around it like a makeshift pyre. And on top of it, I saw a figure. Naked. Dancing. "Oh God," the biologist whispered, lifting a trembling hand to her mouth. "Jane?" It was Jane. Her naked body twisted and writhed in the flames as her screams pierced the howling storm. She howled, her voice carrying through the darkness, until the fire consumed her entirely. We watched in stunned silence as she collapsed, her charred remains still. We descended the ladder, numb and broken. No one spoke. We just sat there in the rec room, the weight of hopelessness crushing us. The physicist still lay in his bed, avoiding everything. At this point, I realized he was far beyond saving. The footsteps echoed again from the empty rooms, but I had stopped caring. If I was meant to die here, then so be it. We huddled together, wrapped in blankets and coats, pressed against the cold wall. A single candle flickered at our feet, the only light source in the oppressive darkness. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight of the dark figure pacing the room in front of us. The next morning, the power flickered back on, though the lights were weak and sputtering. Groggy and defeated, we rose, disoriented. I heard faint music playing in the showers. Together, we walked toward the source of the sound. Inside, we found the song, "Jesus Take the Wheel," playing on an endless loop from an old MP3 player. The room was eerily gray, the tile damp and cold. And there, sitting on the floor in front of the player, was the physicist. He was naked, his pale skin smeared with blood, which dripped down the drain. He turned his head toward me slowly, lifting his left hand to his lips and hissing a long, deliberate shh. In his other hand, he held his mutilated genitals, blood pooling around him. His eyes closed, and a wide, toothy grin spread across his face. "I like this song now," he whispered, his voice filled with an unsettling calm. "God," the doctor muttered, taking a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, boy. I'm here to help." The physicist's smile widened, eyes still shut, his teeth bared in a grotesque snarl. Then, without warning, he shrieked, a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. He lunged at the doctor, knocking him to the ground and sinking his teeth deep into the doctor's throat. Blood sprayed from the wound, pooling beneath them as the physicist bit down harder, his teeth stained red. The physicist stood, blood dripping from his lips, and turned his wild, deranged gaze on us. The doctor lay on the floor, choking and gasping for air, his life draining away. Just as the physicist prepared to leap at us, a deafening bang filled the room. My ears rang, the sound unbearable. When the ringing subsided, I saw the physicist's body lying in a pool of blood, a bullet hole in the center of his forehead. One of the maintenance workers stood there, holding a smoking pistol. Now, we were 4. Just me, the biologist, and the 2 maintenance workers. Everyone else was dead or missing. The power might have come back on, but the satellite was down, cutting off any hope of radio or internet communication. We paced, cried, and panicked, desperate for a way out, until one of the maintenance men finally broke the silence. "Our only chance is to fix that satellite dish," he said, his voice grim. The rest of us nodded in silent agreement. He was right. There was no other option. "I'll go," the other maintenance worker volunteered. "No," said the first. "We'll go together." The biologist and I couldn't argue. We watched as they suited up, then disappeared into the blizzard outside. Hours passed, and we frantically searched for any signal, any sign that they had made it, but there was nothing. Finally, the signal came back. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, we smiled, relief washing over us. We thought maybe, just maybe, we had a chance now. We sat, waiting eagerly for the 2 maintenance men to return, and waited, and waited. But deep down, we both knew. The smiles had faded, replaced by the crushing realization that we were the last ones left. Neither of us said a word, but it was clear. We were alone. Eventually, the biologist fell asleep in my lap, exhausted after crying ourselves into silence. As I sat there, my eyes heavy, I swear I heard something. A faint giggle like the laughter of a child. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up, but when I did, I was utterly alone. Panic gripped me as I called out for her, my voice echoing through the empty halls. I searched every room, my heart pounding, dreading what I might find. And then I found her. She was in the observatory. Her body lay still, her eyes blank and staring into the endless snowstorm outside. Beside her was a note, a beautiful, heart-wrenching message about wanting to see the world one last time before she died. In her arm was an empty syringe. She had taken her own life, escaping the nightmare in the only way she could. I didn't have the strength to move her. I left her there, hoping she found peace in her final moments. Now, I sit here, writing this, likely in my last moments of clarity. The reason I'm documenting this, the truth I've uncovered, the nightmare we were unknowingly dragged into. The reason I'm about to put an emergency flare gun in my mouth and end this madness. I returned to the office I had been using. By that point, I was hysterical, barely clinging to reality. I caught my reflection in the display mirror, and what I saw stopped me cold. My eyes, they were completely black. The shock of it brought me to a breaking point, and in a fit of rage, I smashed the mirror. Blood ran down my knuckles from the shards, and the pain grounded me, if only for a moment. That's when I noticed it. A small slip of paper had fallen from the shattered glass. It was a note, with a picture attached. Trembling, I picked it up and began to read. If you're reading this, I hope it's not too late. This place is not what you think. The man in charge, he's not some religious nut. He's far more dangerous. By now, you've probably found that undiscovered lockbox. The trinkets inside were meant to spook you, especially if there's a minister in your group to point out the evil in the objects. But that's all part of the setup. The black dust that came out, that wasn't dust, and it wasn't evil. God, I wish you knew. These people aren't here to colonize anything. Have you ever wondered why you're so isolated from any other research stations? This is a weapons testing facility. You and your team have unknowingly been exposed to compounds designed for a private company. Specifically, this compound, a psychosis-inducing pathogen, was created to drive world leaders insane, causing them to turn on their own people. The concept is simple. Make the enemy destroy itself from within. If you've breathed in the black dust, it's already too late. There's nothing you can do but try to get this message out. But be warned, do not trust the maintenance men, and do not trust the tall therapist. They work for Earl. After he visits, they'll vanish, leaving no trace. They've been observing your behaviors, logging everything. Even if the blizzard lets up, even if you try to escape, you won't survive. You'll be found and killed. I'm so sorry. I lost my entire team to this. I wish to God you hadn't come here. I'm sorry. Dave. Attached to the note was a picture. It showed a team, huddled together for what must have been a group photo. In red ink, one man was circled, labeled me. The man in the photo wore an orange hoodie and jeans. He looked unassuming, mousy even. But now I understood. This was all a trap, from the beginning. We were never meant to survive. We were just pawns in some horrific experiment, playing out in the freezing desolation of this forsaken wasteland. And now, there's no one left but me.